And we're back on the Real Estate Coffee Break here with our special guest, my friend, my evil twin, and my co-host here on the Real Estate Coffee Break, Ian Robbins. Hello, Ian. How are you, my friend?
Glad to be here, John. I like being the evil twin, so I can tell it like it is. And I'll be the heavy. You're the good cop. I'll be the bad cop.
Okay. All right. Well, don't reveal any secrets that we don't want revealed, at least at this particular time. So, hey, I think we need to talk about rent control. As you know, last Saturday after Real Estate Coffee Break, I drove to the neighborhood church on McClendon, just south of Candler Park in DeKalb County. And I was surprised to find that it was full. There were probably 125, maybe 150 people there. And this thing went on for 4 hours.
Wow.
And it was called a People's Town Hall, Rent Control Now. And I would like to share with you one of the posters that they offered for me to take home with me, so that I would have a souvenir to put on my walls. And I was surprised to see that it was sponsored by the here it is, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, as well as the Housing Justice League. I don't know what Georgia for All is, but they certainly have bright and colorful posters. And they intend, during this, I was only there for about an hour and a half, and it became very tedious because it was a litany of speakers who were either Section 8 malcontent renters who wanted totally free rent. In fact, they want to be paid to rent. And those were the people that seemed to be being taken advantage of. And it was interspersed with young college students who seemed to be devotees of Karl Marx and his Communist Manifesto, which I found rather surprising. And I said, well, I'm not going to take this seriously. And after an hour and a half, it dawned on me, these people are serious. They intend to introduce legislation into the Georgia General Assembly in January of 2024 to lift the ban, the 39-year-old statewide ban on rent control in Georgia. Now, Georgia, Ian, is among probably 35 states that have rent control bans in one form or another. Georgia's is particularly effective in that it is state law, and no county or municipality is allowed to pass any legislation that caps rents in any way. Thank goodness. But as you know, because you were very active in this was about the time I got a new knee. You stepped up, you went to the Capitol, and you demonstrated for landlord freedom and for free enterprise and for the American way of doing business. And thank you for that. Tom Tubasing was there. You also, and Tom also testified in front of a Senate subcommittee. I believe it was the Judiciary Committee. And I think the two of you almost single-handedly, along with a lot of people that volunteers that agreed to contact their representatives, turned the tide on that and caused it to simply die. It was tabled on the last day of the legislature. But I am worried about what might happen once the Atlanta Journal-Constitution gets hold of this, trust me, they will come up with an entirely new attack on private property ownership, as is their want to do. They are anti-private property. They are pro-socialism. And I know that when we hear these words, Ian, we think surely nobody is a socialist today. Nobody is espousing communism. These are defeated concepts. I assure you, and everyone watching and listening right now, there are plenty of people with whom socialism and its ugly cousin communism are alive and well.
Well,
and go ahead.
So I really appreciate everything you're saying. And first off, going back to what happened in the last legislative session, thank you to all those people listening who did write to their legislators. I think Tom and I did something, but nothing that was just part of a bigger picture. And I think those emails were very good because they basically caught them before they did something drastic. So now that we're in front of it, John, I appreciate what you're saying. And I like to think of something way out there, but I think you'll appreciate this. Of course, we have satellites and they can take pictures at night of the world.
Right.
And it's very simple, very, very easy to see that if you look at America, it's lit up. I mean, that's what democracy is, just lit up coast to coast. I mean, maybe in the middle with farmland and things like that. And then you look at all these other countries and it's not so lit up. And it's the point is that's what economic systems are. But it goes to the free hand. So we don't offend anybody. Let's use a car. A car has value because of what a buyer and seller will pay. Sell and what the market will bear. And there's, you can tell you have a great car, but it's going to be a free enterprise system based on that car. And I think rent is like that. I get it. It's about housing. So they can say that, I think one of those posters was rent is a human, a human right. Okay. Housing is a human right. Okay. So
there it is. There's the poster you're referring to. Housing their idea is that all housing should be free.
Right.
And that to me is antithetical to the way this nation was founded, based on life, liberty, and private property ownership. Right. And I will always believe, as I know you do, that owning a home is part of the American dream. I understand that there are many people who prefer not to own real estate. That's fine. But one of the things I'm working for, and I know you are too, is to make home ownership available to as many people as can reasonably afford it and wish to own it. And this is, I think, one of the failings of the real estate community, the lending community, and the legal community. We have not stepped up. We have allowed government to control this whole process so that low to moderate income housing is no longer buildable in most areas of the United States, certainly in most areas of Georgia. So let's dive into this. I like your analogy with a car. A car has value. There's nothing magic about a car, but it has value based on what people are willing to pay for it. And housing is no different. Everybody's got to live somewhere. And this concept, Ian, goes back to the days of the caveman. There was a caveman somewhere that took a club, went over and hit a beautiful woman on the head, dragged her by the hair into his cave, and said, I saw this in cartoons anyway, and said, we're going to have a home here, and we're going to raise our children to understand and appreciate life, liberty, and personal property rights under the United States Constitution. Now, it's possible that that caveman didn't have a full understanding of the U.S. Constitution because Thomas Jefferson had not written it yet. But nonetheless, I think we can agree that the United States of America and our free enterprise system has lifted more people, and capitalism has lifted more people out of poverty worldwide than every other system put together.
By far. And John, that's what America is about, and the media will have you think differently. But John, I'm going to say something embarrassing, but then thank you. Last year when House Bill 404 came up,
yep,
if you would have asked me 2 days previous, I would have said impossible. Now I see the rent control, and part of me says, that's not going to fly. But then the fact that they had this meeting, and things could show up in the legislature this session, and we now, instead of putting my head in the sand saying, no, it'll never happen.
Well, let me just say this. Based on my experience last Saturday, I think it is a virtual certainty that some nutmeg is going to introduce this into the House of Representatives. Probably not, into the Georgia House. I doubt it will originate in the Senate, which appears to be slightly more sane. But there are a lot of, let's just say, nutmegs in the Georgia House that are happy with things like this. And I will share with you, I was appalled when House Bill 404 last year ended up being passed unanimously by the Georgia House of Representatives and then received a standing ovation. And I think I was stunned. But this was an effort of socialists who want to see this happen. Let's go to the slides. And
I have a question.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So to be in front of it, here we are. It's January 15th, Saturday. And when do we start contacting our representatives? When do they start paying attention? When do they check their email? How does that work? I don't know about.
Let me tell you how it works. If we wait until January, and by the way, you and I were caught asleep at the switch last year.
Yep.
No choking, no choking on real estate coffee break, please. If you need to choke, just go ahead, put your head in a trash can and choke. I'll cut that out later. I had fully admit I was caught asleep at the switch. I had no idea that this was happening. Thank goodness it was brought to my attention. And I just didn't think it was possible. And it was, in fact, possible and happened. So I just would share with you that these people are very determined to do this in 2024. We need to begin contacting representatives now, because on January the 2nd, when the 2024 session of the General Assembly opens, it'll be too late. At that point, leadership in both the House and the Senate takes over, and they control the flow of events from that moment forward. We were lucky last year, thanks to your efforts and Tom Tubasing's efforts and the efforts of many volunteers. But we need to be proactive this year. So let's dive into our slides and see what's going to happen here. I would bring to everyone's attention, and Ian, I'm hoping that you're seeing my slide right now.
Oh yeah, rent control won't work. Rent control.
It won't. I would encourage everyone within the sound of my voice and our picture to go to GeorgiaRentControl.com. We at Liberty RIA and Georgia Real Estate Coffee Break have set up a web page to educate our legislators and our landlords and our realtors and realtists as to the problem at hand. And it's a very serious problem and one that I want everybody to know about. So that's the first thing to do. So let's forge ahead and look at our next slide, if I can figure out how to do it. Rent control is not going to work. And here's why. We need to talk about who is in favor of rent control. And here's what the answer is. It's radical socialists seeking the end of capitalism. There are virtually no traditional tenant advocates who think this is a good idea, Ian. It is a radical bunch of people who I didn't even believe existed. It's also very poor tenants who want something for free. I don't blame them. I would like something for free. And virtually no respected economist in the United States or even in Europe thinks that rent control will work. It has proven time and time again to be a disaster. But because of A and B, C, nobody pays attention to economists, and they are listened to by pandering politicians. And I hate to say that because I don't know the Speaker of the Georgia House. I wish him well, whatever his name is, God bless him. I am happy for him. But he announced early on that he was in favor of House Bill 404, which you and I fought against and defeated. And he was able to turn that into a standing ovation and a 100% approbation from the House. And I just think that is disgusting. So I don't know who this guy is. I'm going to presume that he simply needs to be educated. Is that fair?
That sounds about right. Also, John, I think it's possible that he created that environment because that was good showmanship and that's good political theater. So to make that happen, say, hey, we are fighting for the working man, and then they let a table. So what I've learned in government, I could be wrong, is I just don't know this game, but I have a feeling there's a lot of maybe smoke and mirrors, and maybe it's just show type of things, but not really going to finish.
Well, can I be honest with you? I don't want to know politics very well. By the grace of God, I lost when I ran for DeKalb County Commission in 1990. It was the closest I ever came to descending into hell. And by the grace of God, I was spared, and I will never pursue that again. Now I think of myself and you at Real Estate Coffee Break as we are political kingmakers. And we are in the shadows, and we are going to manipulate these puppets that we have. So I shouldn't use that word. They're not puppets, but we're going to help educate them. Let's look at where rent control has been tried. New York City,
Yep.
San Francisco, and Toronto have been enduring locations where rent control has existed. Each has been an unmitigated disaster.
And you know, John, my father, blessed memory, I remember when I was 11 years old, and he made a
Yep.
point of when he said many of people he knew would take the keys and go to City Hall and just said, take the building. I can't do this anymore. Have a nice life. In San Francisco yesterday, a couple of days ago, there was a brewery that's been around for something like 149 years, went out of business because nobody wants to buy a brewery now in San Francisco because they got some serious socialism problems, and it's a really hard place to invest in. I don't know anything about Toronto. I really don't. But
Well, we're going to talk about it a little bit here today. So let's see where we go from here. It's clear now after rent control largely began in the United States during World War I. It was dormant during the years after World War I and until World War II. And then it was reinstituted. And the idea was that, look, during the war, we need to focus 100% of the energy of the country toward defeating the enemy. And I get that. And I understand that there was a lot of unusual activity by the government to make sure that we were all focused in the right direction. I'm not criticizing that. But largely, rent control dropped off in almost all cities in America after the end, after VJ Day, which was in 1946. And, it was a phenomenon, but it does not, we now can look back and see that it does not work as intended. Here's what we need to know. Rent control today is rare because history shows us it does not work as intended. And it turns out that rent control is a short-term fix for current residents at the great expense of long-term affordability for a much broader population. And this is from a Stanford economist. Virtually all respected economists state that rent control simply does not work. It is an artificial, you referenced the invisible hand of free enterprise, which balances supply and demand. This is an attempt. The key word in rent control is not rent, Ian, it's the word control.
Yep.
And as we see almost universally, when government tries to overreach and control any industry, it's a disaster.
Absolutely, John. And it's funny. I know that you've taught for decades single family house, and those are the renters that we talk with, and that's what we work with. But because of what I do full time, I'm in a lot of let's just say midtown, and I'm in these beautiful high rises, and they got amenities on top of amenities. I mean, they're incredible. I walked up to a lobby the other day, and it was like, this is awestruck. And they had the golf course, and they had the pool, and they had the barbecues, and 10 other things. And with rent control, I'll probably getting ahead of myself. These amenities wouldn't be available, and that's the level that they can. Because here you got a young guy or gal who doesn't have a car.
Yep.
I know people that say, "Listen, I can get on a train, I can get to the MARTA, then I get to the plane, and be in Dallas, Texas by 10 o'clock." And I believe them. And it's incredible what happens today, and that's Atlanta. But for the rest of us who deal with single family houses, is a whole nother level of rent. So it's hard to put your finger on it.
I think you're going to see here in just a minute, one of the big things that happened in Toronto and New York is apartments converted to condos so they could sell them instead of rent them and avoid rent control. So let's see what really happens. Rent control, like all other government mandated price controls, is a law placing a maximum price or a rent ceiling on what landlords can charge tenants. And if it is to have any effect, the rent level must be set at a rate below that which would otherwise have prevailed. I mean, if you said that the rent ceiling was $100,000 a month, that wouldn't affect any rent. So because it's below market, by definition, demand increases while supply declines. And
Yep.
this has been recognized by everybody. Now, you might argue, let's just exempt new construction from rent control. So it's okay. Well, it turns out, Ian, the science says otherwise. Although many rent control ordinances in the United States and Canada have specifically exempted new rental units from coverage, investors are not stupid. They're too cautious or maybe too smart to put their faith in rental housing when you've got this pandering political class that really wants to do this. In numerous cases, housing units supposedly exempt forever from controls were nonetheless brought under the provisions of this law due to some, quote, emergency, end quote, or other. New York's government, for example, New York City, has 3 times broken its promise to exempt new or vacant units from rent control. So prevalent is this as practice of rent control authorities of breaking their word that a new term has been invented to describe it, and it's called recapturing these rental units. And it literally is capturing them because it removes them from the free market.
Absolutely. And these are making sense. And it's pretty blatant there that a government broke their word 3 times.
It's scary. It is simply scary. So let's talk about what the owners do in order to respond to this ridiculousness. The science of economics also tells us that rent controls not only limit new supply, but they also lead to removal of existing supply, which is sort of remarkable. Because of the rent, listen to this, because of the rent control and its violations of the rights of landlords and tenants, New York City has suffered from a severe paucity of new rental construction. In the 1970s and into the 80s, more units were abandoned each year by landlords than were built. And the landlords just said, look, I can't operate under this. I'm walking away from it. Help yourself, which means all those people would have to move out. It was just not a possibility for them to live there anymore.
Well, wait, John, does that mean that they would abandon them so they wouldn't have to maintain them?
Right. They had no money to maintain them. They had no money to make repairs. They were prohibited from raising the rent. Meanwhile, the cost of everything, including taxes and insurance, was skyrocketing, and that we had owners just walking away from their property, abandoning their apartment buildings, and saying, look, anybody wants it, knock yourself out. Now, most of these had mortgages, obviously, and so you had the mortgagee in possession, but the mortgagee, the lender didn't want them either, because there was no way under rent control to make them profitable.
So what happened?
They were abandoned. They went into total disrepair, and they literally are empty to this day.
But you know what, John? Nobody died. Nobody had a fair housing claim. Nobody got injured. And
That's true, but all of those people were displaced, which I think is really sad. And of course, the rights of the landlords were just raped in this situation. This is a legal rape. Now, some renters do benefit. The science of looking at rent control tells us that rent control does provide a benefit to a share of households, but at an enormous cost, one being the inability to fund repairs and maintenance. Rent control often leads, particularly in New York City and San Francisco and Los Angeles, to poorly maintained, outdated housing, and you end up with battles between tenants and landlords over upkeep.
So what happens when the newspaper gets involved and says they're poorly maintained? That's because of rental control.
Well, and you saw that series last year by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution talk about yellow journalism. Go find the worst abuse case in Metro Atlanta and act like it is representative of every rental in the state.
And it always has pure sewage. Every single article.
It's worse than that. There are rats, and it's. I don't even want to go there. It just makes me sick.
But I can write the article. It's easy to write the article for them.
Well, let's forge ahead. You see there a picture of our friend Ed Koch.
Well, yeah.
You remember Ed? Ed's a good old boy. Everybody liked Ed. He was a screaming liberal, but he had he had repartee with the media, and everybody liked him. Well, it turns out, in reality, that Ed was benefiting from rent control.
Really?
Yeah. It turns out that rent control primarily benefits wealthier households who do not need the benefit. As a case in point, former New York City Mayor Ed Koch, for decades, kept a $475 a month bargain rental in high-end Greenwich Village.
Love it. Go ahead.
Which meant he and many others received benefits that others needed much more, which means wealthier households are either squatting in affordable units or squandering benefits that could otherwise be spent on lower income households in need. I think
on a side note,
yeah,
I was talking to an EMT one time, and he explained to me that the rich people in New York take advantage of the EMTs because they can. So they can be rich, they can have plenty of benefits, but somehow they get a situation where they get free medical care. And he was explaining to me that they could come out of a really, really nice place, but get in the ambulance because it's a better ride and they don't have to pay for parking or whatever and spend all that money. And then he even explained to me that the EMTs had a button, and the button said, taxi cab driver. And they had that on for about a week until the commissioner of EMTs, whatever that is, said, you can't do that, guy.
I'm sure. It's amazing to me. And the other thing is, we are honestly dealing here with people who have subscribed to Karl Marx's theory that says, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. And that's the basis of communism. And Karl Marx wrote that in his manifesto. And it scares people. And at least in the United States, historically, price controls were associated with the Soviet Union, which sort of made it a red flag for many Americans. For Soviets, price controls led to severe supply shortages. Do you remember they always said, Our bread is only 10 cents a loaf, while yours in America is over $1. Well, then they would show empty shelves. No, nobody could make bread for 10 cents a loaf, but boy, it was cheap if you could find it.
Right.
And so we had these severe supply shortages, and then there was a runaway black market and depression. 3 decades later, memories and lessons are fading. And we have these young people today who have embraced worldwide communism and want to see the United States abandon free enterprise and the right to own private property rights, the right to own real estate, and instead go toward a communist direction. So here's the solution. Rent control proponents like to point to Europe, but they fail to point out that there's been a resulting disaster of a supply shortage. Here's a quote from a leading economist in Sweden, and left-wing economists love to point to Sweden. This guy said 5% of the entire population is on a waiting list for a rental. Wow. Holy mackerel. In this country, Ian, that would be 5% of 330 million would be 15, 16 million people on a waiting list for rental. So we got to pick up and move along here because we're running out of time. But let me show you what happened in Toronto. Rent control sharply reduced new construction to only pricey units and gave way to a surge in for sale condos as shadow alternatives. They were bought by small investors who were exempt from rent control and then rented out individually. Ultimately, that made affordability worse.
What does that mean, John? What does shadow alternatives mean?
Shadow alternatives means that individuals were able to get around rent control by buying individual units and then renting them privately to people who were willing to pay top dollar for them.
But how does that get? So in other words, the owner of the building is required to do rent control, but not if he sells that.
That is correct. That if he sells to an individual, that individual then can privately rent at whatever price he wants in this shadow market.
So in other words, entrepreneurs and real businessmen are going to find a way around it because that's what they always do, and that's what they need to do.
Right, but listen to this, Ian. Toronto had rent control since 1975. For years, the buildings constructed after 1991 were exempt. That's how they got people theoretically to come in and build. But a liberal government ended that in 2018.
Wow.
And then a progressive government, progressive conservative government came back in, and it succeeded in decreeing that new buildings would once again be exempted, but everything prior to 2018 are now under rent controls. So again, the government makes the promise, but they don't live up to it. It's too easy to take advantage. So let's talk about what happens when rent control ends. Cambridge, Massachusetts. This is not a bastion of conservatism. You got Harvard University there, and their own research showed the city benefited from the removal of rent control in the 1990s. A Harvard professor noted more supply, more maintenance, more upgrades, and less crime. That was at Harvard, of all places.
Could it get more liberal than that?
You sure can. Economists in general say that rent control won't work. Now, we're probably not familiar with the IGM survey. It stands for the international global market survey of economists. But
we need another acronym.
yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, the IGM is most famous for weekly polls it conducts of its economic expert panels, which consists of 43 leading economists in the United States panel, 49 leading economists in the European panel. Their most recent survey showed that only 2% of these leading economists said rent control in places like New York and San Francisco have had a positive impact on affordable housing. This is while all these radical groups are demanding it day and night. IGM is a research center at the prestigious University of Chicago Booth School of Business, which obviously brought us Milton Friedman, who was a Nobel Prize winner there. So, but the interesting thing to me, Ian, and I'd like your thoughts about this, ideas opposition to rent control is not a partisan issue. Economists on both sides of the aisle oppose it. You've got right-wing Milton Friedman, who is no longer with us, but certainly was a leading voice in economics in the United States for many years. You also have, and a Nobel Prize laureate, you also have left-wing Gunnar Myrdal, who was also a Nobel Prize winner from Sweden, who agreed that rent control didn't work. And the incredible thing is, and I don't know if you've ever read his articles, there's a guy, an economist who writes for the New York Times called Paul Krugman. And he is one of the most liberal economists I've ever heard of. And he agrees that rent control has been a disaster for New York City.
And John, looking at that, having it nonpartisan and having the liberal people agreeing with rent control is a bad thing. Maybe when it puts up his head during the legislature this year, it'll get popped down by both parties.
I don't think so. I don't believe it. There was a progressive economist in Sweden named Gunnar Myrdal, and he wrote a book in 1954 called An American Dilemma, The Negro Problem and Modern Democracy. Now, I know that is a problematic title today. We don't like to use that terminology. I want everybody to just recognize this was 1954.
Wow.
But Myrdal is best known in the United States for his landmark study of race relations, which culminated in this book. And it was a very progressive book at the time. And interestingly, you and I are both familiar, I hope, with the 1954 landmark U.S. Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education, which said separate but equal is not constitutional.
Got it.
And that was a huge breakthrough in civil rights. Apparently, the court was heavily influenced by the writings of Gunnar Myrdal at that time. And he has stated, so I give him credit for recognizing that separate but equal was not equal. And in fact, it was just racist. And he stated on rent control. Rent control has, in certain Western countries, constituted maybe the worst example of poor planning by governments lacking courage and vision.
Wow, that's pretty strong.
That is pretty strong. And while I don't know that much about Gunnar Myrdal, I am impressed that he was taken very seriously by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1954 in a decision that I think all Americans would join today in looking back and saying that was the right decision. I think he also weighed in correctly on rent control, especially in the Western countries of the United States and others. So let's go back to Harvard. I know that's one of your favorite places.
Yep. Emory, Harvard of the South. Keep going.
There you go. That's it. Harvard has an economist named Ed Glazer. And here's what he said. The most natural tool towards affordability is supply, and to make sure that we're making it easy enough to build moderate cost rental apartment buildings in these cities. And instead, just the opposite has happened. He goes on to say, ironically, most cities with rent control or that are seriously discussing it are themselves guilty of making it way too difficult to build housing, which makes what does get through much more expensive.
Wow.
Ian, I know you've been to Manhattan, as have I, and you see a construction site and they have hundreds of permits up on a board. And every department of New York City has to weigh in on, you have to pay money to get somebody to come out and say, okay, this is, it's going to have zero climate impact and it's going to have blah, 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 blah. And apparently that's just very typical in cities with rent control. And we go back to the key word within rent control, which is not rent, it is control.
That's exactly right.
And this is coming from a liberal economist at Harvard. And that's why it's easier to build in Atlanta, Georgia, and it's easier to build in Dallas, Texas, than it is in Manhattan and in New York City. So no wonder they want rent control. It makes them think they're solving the problem. Now, here's an interesting solution. It turns out that direct subsidies to lower income renters are also effective in solving housing access issues without distorting supply. But the truth is this, Ian, they're underfunded at every level, and they're too often entangled in red tape. The best example is Section 8. Ian, I'm going to ask you a question right now. Have you ever had any one of your properties enrolled in the Section 8 program?
Yes.
I did once. And they called me up and said, okay, we're going to do your annual inspection. And I said, what annual inspection? And they said, we always do an annual inspection. And I said, well, is there a problem? They said, we don't know, but we're probably going to find one. We always do. And I said, okay, you go ahead. I think the property is in excellent condition. This, by the way, was new construction.
Wow.
So they came back to me and said, there's an empty lot next door to you that has a privacy fence, a 6-foot wood privacy fence all around your lot, and the lot next to you is vacant, and it has kudzu growing in it. And we're worried that that kudzu is going to grow over your fence and impact your property.
Wow.
And we are stopping your rent. You don't get any more rent starting today because you're in violation of the kudzu provision. And you, at your expense, have to trespass on somebody else's lot and cut their kudzu to our satisfaction before we will enable your rent.
Amazing. So they're telling you to break the law, trespass on somebody else's property, and kill the kudzu, which is very hard to do, so you can continue getting rent from the Section 8 program.
That is correct. I tried to find out who the owner of that property was. It had apparently been abandoned, or at least I couldn't find any person who claimed ownership of it. And so I calmly hired one of my men to go over there and spray Roundup on all of the kudzu. I knew that I could be sued. I knew if the employee had a trip and fall or a stumble and fall, I would be liable. I knew that I was trespassing. But Section 8 was, at that time, they saw me as the enemy as opposed to a stakeholder. And I just think that Section 8 annual inspections and Section 8 rental price limits scare off a lot of owners who might have considered entering the program. Do you realize, in addition to that, Ian, in certain parts of the country, I don't think in Metro Atlanta, but certain parts of the country, you actually have to seek permission from the housing authority before you can file for eviction if the tenant doesn't pay their share.
Wow. Wow. Well, John,
is that red tape or what?
It's red tape, but I had some great experiences actually with Section 8. And I will tell you that one lady, I was real proud of her. Over 3 years, every time not only did they have an inspection, but they re-looked at her income, and she got it down to where Section 8 was paying $50, and she was paying everything else. She worked her way out of Section 8.
Good for her. Good for her. That's in contrast to my Section 8 story, where my lady was getting 100% paid by Section 8 because she had no income. However, every day at 8 a.m., she went and got in her car and drove somewhere. She was gone until 5 o'clock when she came home. Now, she may have been going to sit in a city park and feed the pigeons, but Monday through Friday, between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m., she was busy somewhere. So, well, I don't know. Here is a quote that I think you'll enjoy, Ian, from left-wing economist Assar Lindbeck. He criticized the Swedish rent control system beginning in the early 1960s. He's gone now, but this later resulted in one of his most famous quotes, and here's what he said. In many cases, rent control appears to be the most efficient technique presently known to destroy a city, except for bombing.
Oh my goodness, look what we've come to here. That's great, John. I think it's incredible. Oh my goodness, before it ends us and the planet. Wow.
And my question to you is, who is supporting this? It's a group in Atlanta called the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Now, here is an actual photograph of one of their rallies. They're big into having rallies. They like to chant things and try to stir people up emotionally and get them to do things. But as you can see here, they don't believe in climate change. They want system change. And they say, end capitalism before it ends us.
Ugh.
And it's the Party for Socialism and Liberation. And you can go to their website at pslweb.org, and you will see their absolutely radical ideas. These people are not normal. I mean, they are wackos. Just to show you that they are very proud of what they're doing. They believe that you, as the owner of your rental property, have no entitlement to any revenue because housing is a human right. It should all be free. And
John, thank you for bringing out the torch and showing us.
You know, I mean, in maybe when we all get to heaven one day, I think housing will be a right for all of us who are in heaven. But on this earth, if you want to live in my house, you're going to have to pay some rent because I've got expenses. And I ain't paying for you to live in my house for free. And these people are going to be very unhappy about having to pay rent. lest you think that their name is not actually the Party for Socialism and Liberation. I pulled this straight off their website, and they're very proud of being the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Here is another one of their rallies. Organized to stop racist evictions and gentrification. So their idea is that anytime there's an eviction, they want to play the race card. And this is why I think some members of the Georgia General Assembly fall prey to their pronouncements. They want to build tenant power. They want to fight back against rent hikes, and they want to demand a rent rollback. And
Well, John,
it's crazy. I mean, it's just crazy.
And to balance this out in the Landlord Survival Guide, just for our listeners, we do talk about raising the rent with the nice rent increase. We talk about the nuisance addition. They're not going to rent it so much that they're going to try to find somewhere else to live. But if you don't, and then you try to raise the rent several years later,
Sure,
you're really hurting them because it's too much. But if you every year do a little bit, it's sort of like the frog who stays in the water, but they get the frog up to 212 and goodbye frog. So we got
goodbye frog. And I just think it's so important for every landlord to understand, whether you recognize it or not, your costs are rising every year. I've had people say to me, Ian, which makes no sense. They say, well, I own it free and clear, so it don't cost me anything, and I just hate to raise the rent. They're nice folks, and I want to keep them. Well, the fact that you own it free and clear is irrelevant. You can check with the house. I do this frequently. Go talk to your house and say, do you care if I own you free and clear or if I have a mortgage? The house will say clearly, I don't care. The house is going to do what the house is going to do, regardless of how you finance it. So you're doing yourself an injustice by not raising the rent, at least marginally, every year. But I just want to point out, these people are not normal. These people are misfits. They are anti-American. They want to replace the free enterprise system with communism. They call it socialism, but it's essentially the same thing. Here they are in Washington, D.C. Cap the rent. Housing is a human right. And it's the same organization that we have in Atlanta. They are in almost all major cities of the United States now, and they tap into this fringe, wacko element and poor renters that want to live for free.
Except for that guy who's on the phones. Go back, you'll see.
Oh, yeah.
He's making a deal. Here
he is. Here he is, right here. He's negotiating with his landlord right there. So let's look at this. I pulled this straight from Wikipedia, and you can look up Party for Socialism and Liberation. I went to look because I wanted to learn more about it, and the first sentence in the Wikipedia discussion says, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, PSL, is a communist party in the United States, established in 2004.
Wow.
And they are not embarrassed about that. They're proud to be socialist and communist, and they want to overthrow the free enterprise system and institute worldwide socialism and communism. And these are not normal people. And we've got to bring to the attention of the Georgia legislature and all of our legislators this challenge that's going to appear in 2024. And we got to do it before January.
And you know, John, I often think about people who do protests. Where do they get the time? Now, yeah, I'm pretty much a workaholic, but do you really have the time? What else are you doing that you're taking away from to go protest?
Boy, these people have plenty of time. The rally was only supposed to go for 3 hours. It went for 5.
What?
And they were all there, and they were all in, and they were doing chants and anti everything that you and I hold dear and sacred.
Thank goodness
Ian,
they could have a party.
Ian, a group of us have created a new website to help right-thinking Americans just say no to rent control in Georgia. And it's called GeorgiaRentControl.com. And I want to invite everyone who's watching and listening right now to please go and join the free market movement. When you're there, you can sign up for a free newsletter. We'll send those out about once a month or whenever there's breaking news. We're going to defeat this thing before the legislature ever begins.
Go, John. Thank you for.
And I feel very comfortable in calling a legislator and saying this is being sponsored by a bunch of radical communists. And I don't mind saying to whoever it is, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
Well, John,
and if they say yes, then I don't need to know any more from them. I'm going to wrap up by just inviting everybody right now to go to GeorgiaRentControl.com, make a donation, $10 all the way up to, I'm telling people, if you're a landlord, consider donating 1 month's rent, because we're going to need, before it's all over, between $10,000 and $20,000 to have lobbyists talk to every representative.
Good idea.
So,
professional lobbyists who know what they're doing.
I'm going to wrap up with this shocking slide. We have here Mr. Karl Marx, founder of communism and the conflict theory between the working man and the capitalist. And his idea, he wrote this, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. Where does that leave you as a real estate investor? I wanted to thank you for your participation today. It helped me. It helped everybody that we have here. I know you've got to run, but God bless Ian Robbins. God bless the free enterprise system, and God bless the American right to private property ownership. And we're going to work to protect those going forward. Ian, thanks for all your contributions. We'll talk to you again real soon.
You bet, John. Bye-bye now.
Bye now.